I am going to cover the Soviet Union, so that's a nice combination with the previous kind of country-specific things. Uh, and unlike the previous speakers, I will concentrate not on one specific form of culture, music. And there are also several things that I'd like to point out while we go along about the interactions that I'm going to speak about. So I will share my screen. Yep. Okay. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. So I'm going to be talking about Soviet music recordings. So basically, I looked at the period of 1950s to 1980, so like mostly 1965 to 1980 would be the actual period. It was a period of very active cultural exchange, as we have seen from the previous speakers. But what I'm going to look at is the role of music and the role of musical recordings. So the actual objects, the records of music, which were produced either in the Soviet Union or in the West with Soviet musicians. So with Soviet classical musicians, because as the previous speakers have pointed out, music was a way to show common kind of universal values. And classical music was one of those things often that had both the instrumental music had universal values, which you could communicate through it. And then if it was the operas, for example, or the songs, they had a bit of a nationalistic Russian folky aspect to them. So you could promote the Russian folk culture through the music of the songs and lots of the operas. Um, what I'm going to talk about, this is the plan. So I'll talk about the period. I'll talk about the interactions, the problems in those interactions between the Soviet Union and the West, and the results of the relationships. But I'd like to point out several things. I'm not talking about so in the Soviet Union, because it was a communist state, was represented by the state, okay? But even when you say the state was not one big coherent organization. The state was actually a lot of different bureaucratic organizations, often competing with each other or often at odds with each other. And that was the case in the case of music relationships, because the record label, the main Soviet record label was Melodia, as I'm sure you know. However, Melodia was not allowed to directly have links and communicate with Western record labels like EMI, Deutsche Grammophon, Chant du Monde, CBS. So the biggest Western labels and the small Western labels had to go through a third bureaucratic organization called Международная книга, International Book. And so all of this inside the Soviet Union was quite complicated and was not obvious that they all had the same aims and the same ways of interacting with the West. And Western companies, where I'm not talking about government at all, I'm actually talking about private capitalist corporations that wanted to earn money, that wanted to bring Soviet musicians to the West to earn money from their recordings and from their concerts. That's going to be my focus. It's going to be the kind of the relationships which were in between politics and economics and culture, like in the middle of those three, because there were different there were different aims and motivations. They were not political at all, quite often. They were much more complex than that. And I will show you as I go along what I mean. So, as I mentioned, I focus on private relationships, especially from the Western side. And I'd like to say that the relationships, the cultural relations, as I'm sure it was the case for lots of the other Eastern European countries, after the death of Stalin, the initial relationships, cultural relationships, and music relationships actually were initiated by private Western impresarios. So the two most famous people were Sol Hurok in the United States and Victor Hockhauser in the UK. They actually came to the Soviet Union to negotiate bringing Soviet musicians, classical musicians, to the West for concerts. And when the Western states realized that, they tried to bring a bit more order and control into this relationship, and they negotiated cultural agreements with the Soviet Union. So the initial interaction was actually initiated by private individuals from the West. Then it went to cultural, kind of a formal cultural agreements between the Soviet Union and different various Western countries. And on the back of those cultural agreements, private record companies and private impresarios started organizing concerts and recording Soviet musicians in the West, or buying their recordings and selling them in the West. Now, the reason I think music recordings are so important, especially in the time period we're talking about, 1960s, 70s, 80s, is because they were the main way of listening to music. So if you look at the history of the record industry in the West, this was the high prime of this type of recordings. And I'm going to show you, if you see where my face is, I'm going to show you some examples, yeah? So this is how people listen to music. I'm sure you have these at home as well. So this was how people learned about Soviet musicians in the West, through these kind of recordings. So say, if you imagine you are somewhere in a small town in the United States, you might not necessarily have access to big concert halls or be able to go and actually listen to a concert by a Soviet musician, but you can go into a record shop and buy an EMI recording. This is a very famous recording concerto with 3 Soviet musicians and a German conductor. So that's why I think these artifacts were super important. They were very popular, and they signify a huge epoch, like a huge time period of new relationships between the West and the Soviet Union. So there were 3 ways. If you imagine how this could work, there were 3 ways. If you were a Western record company trying to get hold of Soviet musicians' recordings of their recordings and bring them to the West and sell them in the shops, there are 3 ways you could do it. You could either wait for the Soviet Union to organize a tour, say to London, to Paris, to Berlin, maybe all over the United States, of a Soviet musician like, say, violinist David Oistrakh or Sviatoslav Richter, or you can try and get the musician to record the same repertoire that they would record on tour. And that's how often the big companies did it. They would just basically record, the musician would give a concert, and then the next day he would record the same repertoire for a big record company. They could also license recordings from the USSR, and one of the biggest agreements on licensing was something called Melozia, you see here. So this was one of the biggest licensing agreements, Melozia. And basically the Soviet Union had a licensing partner per country. So they choose one big record label. In France, it was Chant du Monde. In the UK, it was EMI. In Germany, it was Areola Eurodisc. There were several partners per one partner per country as a rule, and they would try and record they would try and license their various recordings to that partner in that country, to the big label. And also the third way was to basically buy Soviet-made recordings from the Soviet Union. But there was a big downside to that, because the quality of the materials of the records was worse than Western quality. It improved gradually, especially after the middle of 1960s, but you could always tell that you could always tell whether the recording was a Soviet one or a Western one by the way it sounded. So motivation, this is the really interesting point, because if you think about it, why would the Soviet Union do all this? And it's really interesting because this comes back to Robert's presentation, that similarly to what Hungary was doing, the Soviet Union first there were ideological reasons. They wanted to promote and show off how amazing Russian musicians, Soviet musicians were. But by the 1960s, it became very commercial. So the main idea was to actually earn foreign currency on these records and on the tours, to then use the foreign currency to purchase goods and services abroad. And that's why from the 1960s, this whole recording thing became much more So the Soviet Union became much more like a capitalist country within the world kind of record industry, like one big record company trying to operate by the rules of the global record industry. And for the Western companies, of course, they wanted to make money. They wanted long-term relationships with the Soviet Union, which was not always possible because they wanted to guarantee a stream of recordings from the Soviet musicians like they did from their Western musicians. And they pretty much tried to treat the Soviet musicians in terms of kind of the contracts, in terms of how they viewed them, very much similarly to the Western superstars from that respect. But because the Soviet Union was communist, it wasn't always, the relationships were not purely capitalist. It was impossible to have the same kind of profit-making long-term relationships as they did when the Western companies operated between themselves. And so here is a typical recording relationship. And this is a simplified way it worked. But this is kind of the big players. So say you were Deutsche Grammophon or Chant du Monde or one of the big Western labels, you wanted to record Sviatoslav Richter while he was on tour, or you wanted to invite him over to Paris for 3 days to do a recording. You would not go to Melodia, who was the record label. They did not have direct access to the Western companies. You would go to Международная книга, which was a bureaucratic organization within the Ministry of Foreign Trade. And they would write to the Soviet Ministry of Culture, and then the Soviet Ministry of Culture would write to Melodia. I mean, by the 1970s, normally what would happen is if you had negotiations, they would be all together in the same room with the Western company talking about relationships and contracts. But if you just sent a letter, please, could we record Sviatoslav Richter in, on the 3rd of March, the 6th of March, this and that year, their letter would go to Международная книга. Международная книга would write a letter to Ministry of Culture. Ministry of Culture would write to Melodia, and then they would write back to each other. So this bureaucratic chain was very long. The turnaround of one letter was about a month. So from the time you wrote to Международная книга to the time you got the reply, it will be about a month, and most of that time was spent, most of that actually was taken up by Melodia, replying very slowly. So that's how you would record a musician, yeah? But there were lots of problems in the relationship, and here is a list of the most interesting ones. I'll quickly walk through those so you understand that all this kind of, although the Soviet Union was interested in selling its musicians, they could not operate by the pure capitalist rules that the Western companies were used to operating. One of the big things for the Soviet Union was country-specific distribution rights, basically meaning that they wanted one record company to be responsible for one country. So the EMI, they wanted to deal with them only in the UK. Chant du Monde, they wanted to deal with them only in France. Like CBS, they wanted to deal with them only in the United States. But the problem for the Western record companies was that they didn't work that way. They were global record companies. In fact, whenever they had like a superstar musician, like Sviatoslav Richter, they actually wanted to sell him in different markets, ideally in the top 5 markets around the world, which were UK, US, France, Germany, and Japan. So if you were EMI and you had a recording of Richter done, you would want to sell at least in 3 of those countries. And the Soviet Union would not allow you to do it because France was not for you, it was for Chant du Monde, not for EMI. And so the record companies were really frustrated by the limitations on their sales that were placed by the Soviet Union. And they often had agreements with each other to sell these recordings, to license these recordings to each other to try and increase the sales. Copyright law was another thing, and it went both ways. So until the Soviet Union joined the International Copyright Convention, both the Western companies and Melodia would pirate each other's recordings. And it wasn't a big deal. I mean, the big labels didn't do it, of course. They didn't pirate. They had official agreements. But there were lots and lots of small labels Like in the United States, there were tens and tens of small labels. There were quite a few that pirated recordings, and they not only pirated Soviet musicians and Soviet recorders, they pirated Eastern Europeans as well. So they pirated Superphone, for example. They pirated quite a few of the other national record labels from Eastern Europe. And Melodia pirated, for example, the Beatles until 1975, when the agreement, when they signed the convention. Soviet bureaucracy, I talked about that. You could see that because there were quite a few different organizations involved, it was not always clear to the Western record label how decisions were made or who to go to get a decision. And decisions were often slow, and that was a problem for planning, because Western companies wanted to plan in advance. You know, they wanted to know that in 6 months' time they'd record Richter. And often they didn't have that long-term visibility to understand which musician would be allowed to the West. This communication was another interesting one for similar reasons. And then musicians' independent decision making was also quite interesting because there's a human factor in the relationships. Because if you think about it, once a musician like Richter, or especially Rostropovich, the cellist Mstislav Rostropovich, was very free-willed. And so when he was out in the West, he didn't really listen to what the Soviet bureaucrats would be telling him. He'd go and record for EMI. And then the Soviet bureaucratic organizations get upset that they didn't get the money for those recordings. So often the musicians wanted a say in where they recorded and what they recorded, and often they made these decisions when they were in the West without talking to the bureaucratic organizations first. Political security concerns, that also influenced a lot of things, unfortunately, and that's why this relationship was different from pure capitalist interactions. Every time there was a political crisis, the performances would be cancelled or boycotted. There was the most famous ones was when there was a tour to the Royal Opera House of the Bolshoi Theater, and there were several concerts cancelled of Richter, or when musicians defected to the West, then Soviet musicians were not allowed to participate in the same Western festivals and Western events as their defected colleagues. So that was why these relationships were not purely capitalist, although both sides were very happy to try and make them as profitable as they could never be just about money making. Was always much more complicated than that when recording the musicians. I'm not going to go into this in detail. I just wanted to illustrate how complicated the bureaucracy around the licensing was. Licensing is basically when the orchestra, for example, or a musician is recorded in the Soviet Union on Soviet Union technology, and then the tape is sent over to the record company in the West, and then the Western record company produces the actual vinyl, the actual record from this tape with its own material and its own cover. So this is, for example, an example of a licensed record. So basically the music on here, the actual original music, the orchestral music, was recorded in the Soviet Union, but then it was sent over to EMI and they produced the whole thing. So they produced the cover, they produced the title, they produced the actual vinyl inside this recording. And the reason licensing are these licensed records, there were lots of them. So the EMI did this, Csunderlik did this, all the big record labels licensed records from the Soviet Union. And the reason these are interesting is because the covers were not controlled by the Soviet Union. What you put on the cover was a decision made by the Western record companies. So they made these cover art decisions based on their internal marketing strategies. They based them so they were the ones presenting Russian and Soviet musicians as they thought they should be presented to the West. And for example, in this case, the record company EMI decided to put St. Basil's Cathedral. No, this is the Spasa na Kravi, the church in St. Petersburg. So they put a church on a Soviet symphony, yeah, on the cover of a Soviet symphony. And this was not a decision which the Soviet bureaucrats or the Soviet government had anything to do with. And there are masses and masses of various covers that were decided and presented by Western record labels to the Western public, which shaped their view of the Soviet Union and of its musicians, and this view was shaped by Western companies. So as a result, there was a huge body of Russian and Soviet music which was available in the West. And when I say music, I mean classical music, first of all. No one was interested in Russian pop music, or, there was no rock music which was allowed in the time period that I look at until the 1980s. It all changed afterwards. The Western public knew lots of the Russian Soviet superstar musicians. They were regarded as in a similar way to their Western colleagues. So the record companies treated them as the same way that they would treat the Western superstars. They marketed them quite often in the same way. If you look at the cover of this, for example, there is no Soviet associations on this cover. It's a very universal cover for classical musicians, right? So you show the performers, you sell the name of the performer. First of all, this could have been a cover for Western musicians. You could not tell the difference if you just looked at the cover. They were treated in the same way by their own brand, not by the word Russian or Soviet. So no one cared they were Russian. They cared that they were mega superstars who could play really well. However, there was also music which was sold on the Russian narrative, like the Russian Soviet stereotypes. And I showed you an example here. There's much more that I looked at in my research. And that was interesting that there was these two streams of presentation. One was the name of the superstar and the brand of the individual. And it didn't matter if he was Russian, Soviet, American, Polish, whatever. And the other, especially the orchestral music, was quite often sold on the Russian stereotypes, the Soviet or the Russian brand. And that's why those images and sleeve covers are so interesting in these records, because they were not in any way influenced or part of the cultural strategy of the Soviet government. They were completely independent from whatever the Soviet government thought or wanted to show. They were part of the marketing strategy of large record labels. And these were the objects which shaped the perception of the Soviet Union, of its culture, of its musicians, throughout those 20 years, because this was the main way in which people heard the music in the West. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.